Welcome to episode 415 of Hot Media with Bob Mann. As you probably know, every week on this program, we discuss the hottest media issues and the hottest media content. And when I have one of my favorite longtime guests on, Dr. Paul Levinson, I don't even do a promo or a teaser at the beginning because I know we're going to talk about a little bit of everything. Paul, as you probably know, is professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University in New York City. I hope you had a great holiday break, Paul.
I did, and it's great to be back here with you once again.
Let's start out. We normally go to the end of the episode before we start to talk about your individual projects. But I want to lead with it this time because I am fascinated by the what ifs, the alternate histories that could be out there. And you're doing a project on Facebook coming up. We're going to be publishing right here at the end of January, so people have plenty of time to make plans to tune into this. Something that's going to be done on Facebook about alternate history. So please talk about that.
Yes, well, I've long been a friend, even though I don't live there, but a friend closer, actually, a little closer to your neck of the woods, to the Science Fiction Association of Bergen County. And I visited them in person many times. But with COVID, and they're still continuing this, every month they have a discussion about some aspect of science fiction. Sometimes they invite someone in to lead the discussion. And they asked me, hey, would you like to come by this February 15th? What would you like to talk about? And I had just finished watching, this was just a couple of weeks ago, the new season on Amazon Prime Video of Hunters. This is the series in which there is a group of people who are hunting down Nazis. And Al Pacino plays the lead role in the series. It's really quite good. And it is an alternate history story because to give one thing away about that series, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun escaped Germany in this alternate history story, and they're living in Brazil, and they're trying to resurrect the Third Reich, in fact, create a Fourth Reich. And so I was thinking about alternate history, and, you know, on the subject of the Nazis, which has been a favorite theme of alternate history, one of my favorite all-time television series and novels is also on Amazon Prime, The Man in the High Castle, which is an adaptation of the Philip K. Dick novel back in the 1960s, also deals with the Nazis, the alternate history of what would have happened had Germany and Japan won the Second World War. And that's a fascinating story as well. And there are really a large number of alternate histories. Sometimes they're not even identified as alternate histories. We may have discussed this already, a wonderful series on Apple. No, is it Apple TV Plus? Yeah, it is Apple TV Plus, called For All Mankind. And that is an alternate history based on you just change one little thing and then you see how everything else happens differently. What would have happened had the Soviets beaten us to the moon back in 1969? And it's a fascinating story. Not to give too much away, Ted Kennedy, as a result of that, becomes president. All kinds of like strange things happen, and it just
it's the old what is it? The butterfly effect that they talk about in Jurassic Park, and because Jeff Goldblum is playing the math professor, it was like, no, there's chaos theory here. One thing happens, you know, the butterfly flaps its wings in Beijing, and it rains in New York, whatever. But what fascinates me about this, Paul, is that so many things came so close to happening. Just one step further for Hitler in terms of creating an atom bomb or having the rocket that could travel across the Atlantic instead of just over the English Channel. the fact that we were woefully unprepared for the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor and had to start a war effort from scratch. We were behind the Soviets for sure when Sputnik went up in the 1950s. So it's not like, oh, that's so far fetched. No, it comes that close. And that's what makes it so interesting.
No, it's fascinating. And, I sometimes think we're living in an alternate history, an alternate history in which a lunatic lost the popular vote in the United States in 2016, but somehow won the Electoral College because of people in the Midwest. I don't know.
Well, I'm certain you've seen the movie Idiocracy from years ago.
Yes.
Unfortunately, though, that was only 500 years in the past rather than 20 years, rather 500 years in the future, excuse me, instead of just like 10 or 20. But the president is a former wrestler and porn star. And it was, isn't that funny? If something bizarre happened. And it happened so fast. And yeah, maybe we are living in an alternate universe and a worldwide plague in the 21st century. I mean, there are just so many things that we don't realize just how bizarre they are. Just before we go on to other things, though, tell me a little bit about the format of what's going to be happening in February. How are you presenting this? Is this a panel discussion, a straight up lecture? How are you doing this?
Well, first of all, it's going to be 90 minutes, which makes a talk machine like me very happy because there'll be plenty of time for me to talk. But it will start off with a lecture from me. But at some undefined point, first of all, if anyone has any questions, I'll probably answer them right away. But probably after 45 minutes or so, I'll open up the discussion to anybody in the audience. And because it'll be on Zoom, we hope to have even an international audience, and anyone who asks a question or even just wants to say something about an alternate history television series or movie that I might not have talked about, or they have another perspective on something I did talk about. So we'll be talking about that. And I don't know. I guess you need a Facebook account. I mean, maybe not, because I've had a Facebook account for so long. I'm not quite sure how that works, but it is on Facebook. And now I guess the best way of putting it on your calendar is just look for me, my name on Facebook, Paul Levinson, and you'll see in my upcoming events on February 15th, it'll say I'm leading a discussion on alternate history. And we hope to see a lot of people there.
Well, that's great. Unfortunately, at least in my view, it won't just be Facebook that you'll be using as social media to publicize this, because unlike me, you decided that no matter how bizarre and lunatic based Twitter has become under Elon Musk, that you would stay with it. I made a very big deal about it. Oh, look, there's my Twitter handle that no longer exists. On the screen, for those watching on video, the people who are listening on audio don't know what I just did. I just put up my Twitter handle on the screen. You've stuck with it. And now it's been, about 2 or 3 months now since Musk took over, since he called for the jailing of Fauci and all of the other strange things, brought Trump back. How has it been in the Twitterverse when you're on there as a person who is not happy with Musk and the direction of the platform?
Well, first of all, although you and I know each other pretty well, I had no idea that you were such a sensitive guy that you would wind up leaving Twitter. I mean, look, I was tempted to leave Twitter too, but I figured, look, I'd like to hang around in the belly of the beast so I can at least, talk about this. And a couple of things. First of all, I should mention that although I'm still on Twitter, I did join another system called Mastodon, and it is a much more pleasant, enjoyable system. And I actually love this other system, Mastodon. It's a lot like Twitter, but
But not that far reaching, though, right? I mean, you're just not going to reach the potential number of people you will with Twitter.
That's right. But on the other hand, I do have a lot more meaningful conversations and interactions with people. It's almost like the early days. It's almost like Twitter for me. I remember what it was in 2006, 2007, when people were like so excited to be able to write to each other. And let me also give a shout out. There's another system called Spoutable, which is going to go online soon. And that's going to be, I think, a very politically effective and open system. So it's not that I'm so devoted to Twitter, I'm not looking elsewhere and doing other things. But Twitter is continuing pretty much the way it was. And this is an interesting observation. If I hadn't known that Elon Musk had bought Twitter and was inviting back, some of these election deniers and saying it's okay for nonsense about COVID to be put up on Twitter, which, by the way, I haven't seen too much of. But if I hadn't known that, I wouldn't have even known that someone like Elon Musk had taken it over. So I guess, in all fairness to Musk, his being at the helm of Twitter hasn't changed it all that much. But being on these other systems, it's become even more clear to me than it was in the past. Twitter, there are a lot of just nasty people on Twitter that I don't follow, but for some reason in the stream of things that I see all too much of them. And whenever I do, I block them because I'm not interested in seeing their MAGA insanity. And that's something that makes it very unpleasant to be on Twitter. But so far, I'll also say, to Musk's credit, although for all I know, he doesn't know about this, NBC invited me to, I'm not sure if the last time I was on your podcast here, this was up and we talked about it. They invited me to write a piece, an op-ed in effect, for something that they call Think. It's NBC Think, and you can search for it there. And it was a piece I wrote about Elon Musk and what he was doing on Twitter, and it was not very complimentary to Elon Musk. And in my typical way, as you know, I put a link to it up on Twitter and I added Elon Musk. And I was actually hoping I did get into an argument with him. It's good publicity, but he didn't say a word. So
that probably made you more upset than some of the nonsense you're reading on there. I highly value your opinion. So what do you think of this? And this has been in the back of my head. Reestablishing a Twitter account just for the podcast. Nothing personal up there, not expressing any views other than here's what's on the show. What do you think?
I think it's a great idea. And look, I think publicity is, I love actually thinking about publicity, doing publicity. It's an amazing thing because you put something out there and you never know who's going to see it, who's going to click that link. And you want, obviously, to get people to listen to your podcast, and more people are better than fewer people. And so by all means, I think it's a great idea. And you don't have to interact too much. You just, as you say, you can almost even automate it probably. Every time the podcast episode is published, the link could go up on this Hot Media Twitter account. So absolutely do it. And if you do, I'll certainly retweet it.
All right. That sounds great. And it's interesting. Every semester I change the day, depending on my schedule, that I publish. So now it's on Wednesdays, at least until the end of May. And what I'll do is on a Wednesday, as soon as it goes up, I'll tweet it. That's going to be the solution. And one of the things about MAGA and all of these things, and we were talking about this just before we started recording, it's very interesting to hear either mainstream, right down the middle news outlets or even to the left news outlets and some of the commercials that they will accept and run. I heard, I won't mention the name of the company, but a major all-news radio station in New York that is at least still affiliated with a major network is running commercials for a survivalist organization, which is basically just saying buy their product because the Civil War is definitely coming. So Now, it's only on their streaming feed, but the streaming feed comes from their parent company. I guess it's still a business, and it is surprising to me to hear it and to see it.
Yeah, well, it's surprising and very irritating, and you see this on television as well as radio. You're watching a station in which you expect, uh, a progressive point of view. It's not that I'm allergic to or I get annoyed to about something that's presenting a position that I don't agree with, but I occasionally, and my wife and I look at each other and say, "What's going on here?" See ads for something that's just complete MAGA insanity on shows that should know better. And of course, the answer is these radio shows and these television shows, unlike this hot media podcast, are in it for the money. They're a business. They have a separate wing which basically goes out and solicits ads. And you might think that wing would be secondary to the news part of the uh, operation, but it isn't. It's actually in the driver's seat. And they do have some standards. They don't accept everything that people might want to present to them and pay them money to broadcast, but they accept far too much. And you mentioned to me when we were talking about this before that you actually listen to this radio station that shall go unnamed. You bought an old-fashioned radio, so you didn't have to stream it. But listen, if you ever come over to my house, you want to talk about old-fashioned radios, I have a radio. We have radio in our family room from the 1940s. It's like one of these, it's not quite one of these big stand-up radios from the 1930s. So it's a desktop radio, but the top of it looks like, I turn it on, I expect to hear FDR giving a fireside chat on it. And so,
Is FM on the different frequencies because they haven't switched FM over to
yeah,
the modern day frequency yet? I love when I
yeah,
see those.
yes, it is. And one of the real kicks I get is I sometimes listen. I used to actually, I don't anymore, but because we've had this for decades, to WCBS FM radio, which used to be an oldies station. I mean, for all I know, it still is. But I would turn it on, and it would just be wonderful hearing this music that I love with these very warm undertones and overtones. It was quite nice. That old-fashioned, you know, inside little vacuum tubes that actually, gave it the power. It's pretty amazing.
Well, of course, I always talk about that you're a professor at Fordham, but beforehand, you were at Fairleigh Dickinson, and I don't think I told you this story. I have an affiliation with WFDU, which, like WFUV, broadcasts the whole tri-state area. And I gave them a donation that allowed me to do 1 hour of their format, which is 60s and 70s top 40 rock and roll. I don't think now I paid for this. I didn't get paid for this, so I guess I can't count it as part of my career, but I don't think I ever had as much fun in 1 hour in all the years I've been in broadcasting. It really was a unique time. That station has captured that, and they got a lot of listeners. They really forgot about the baby boomers, Madison Avenue, and even if you listen to CBS FM, they're an oldie to them is something from the 90s or 2003.
Yeah, listen, I have a WFDU FM radio story to quickly tell you. I used to actually teach at Fairleigh Dickinson University, and I guess I was an assistant professor there when Phil Oakes, a folk singer that a lot of people have never even heard of him. In many ways, he was better than Bob Dylan, but he was a little bit of a troubled guy, and he eventually, sadly, tragically, took his own life in the mid 1970s. When I was teaching at Fairleigh Dickinson, so I had already been on several radio shows there, and I asked the program director, "Hey, I'd like to do a special on Phil Oakes." And he said, "Sure, how long would you like to do it?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know, 2, 3 hours." So he said, "Okay, go in there." And I invited my friend, another media theorist, Joshua Meyerowitz, who then was teaching at the University of New Hampshire. So we did the show. We went into the studio, and it took 3 hours. And the program director calls me up a couple of days later and says, "Look, I know you said 2, 3 hours, but we don't really have all that much time, so that we're going to have to trim the show to 2 hours." And I said, "Oh my God, there's a lot of good stuff. We could trim maybe 5-10 minutes." But he said, "Look, I'm sorry. You're a professor. I'm trying to be respectful, but I'm the program director. It needs to be 2 hours." So this will show you listeners what kind of guy and person I was, at least back then. What I did is I had already, this was of course before email, sent the New York Times, the people who list, the radio shows, a letter telling them about the show. And in the letter, I said it's a 3-hour show and I expect it will be on such and such. And so right after I get off the phone with the program director, I get a call from the New York Times. They were just confirming the show's going to be on Saturday, blah, 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 from 12 noon to 3 p.m., right? And I'm thinking, and before I could stop myself from saying this, I said, "Yeah, it'll be on from 12 to 3." So I didn't say anything, but I knew what I did. And so about the day before, I called the program director and I said, "Look, I heard from the New York Times it already went to press. There was some kind of misunderstanding, and they put the show as being on for 3 hours. What are we going to do?" And he said, "Well, we'll have no choice. We'll have to play your full 3-hour show on Fox." Yeah.
Remind me not to cross you. Speaking of trimming, by the way, we're over 20 minutes, but I do want to actually talk briefly about what we had planned to talk about, which we haven't even gotten to, which is typical of an episode that we would do together. And that is having mainstream media, or even progressive media, however you want to handle it, have to cover Biden allegedly doing something as egregious as Trump has done. Granted, it's only one thing, but we hear over and over again, and especially the political scientists who come on here will say repeatedly, don't engage in whataboutism. How do they do that, knowing that this is just handing over an excuse for Trump, but yet they still have to remain true to what they say they do, which is to be fair and objective? How is that balance working out, in your opinion, for networks like CBS and NBC?
It's not working out very well because I think that in general, the networks or all the news media are handling this a little lamely. They're focusing a little bit too much on, "Oh my God, Biden has classified documents also, and now Pence has classified documents." It seems to me the essence of the Trump story is not even so much that he had classified documents, but that he refused to hand them over in the first place when it was discovered that he did, and then in his typical way made up all kinds of excuses. And it's also a problem as to where those documents were stored, in his place in Mar-a-Lago, where he had everyone and their grandmother or grandfather come and visit him if you could pay whatever the amount of money was and be his guest there. So that, I think, is the nub of the story. But frankly, I think that the media in general have a warped sense of what Fox News used to call fair and balanced, which actually was nonsense when Fox News said that. But I mean, you don't have to be balanced. You have to present the most important news and explain it accurately. You don't always have to give time to the other side. And not all things are equal or even comparable. So sure, the Biden classified documents problems should certainly have been reported and mentioned, but they've made way too big a deal of it. And now, of course, Pence, is in hot water. They discovered some documents with him. They'll probably find out that George Washington took home a classic document and left it at Mount Vernon. So, they get fascinated and sucked into these issues and give them far more time than I think is necessary.
Well, I'll paraphrase Murrow. I'm not going to say it's a direct quote, but I searched my conscience, and there are not two equal sides to every story. There may be two sides to every story, but there's certainly not two equal sides to every story. Before we go off, I want you to just update me briefly on what's happening with your radio play.
Yeah, so this is a radio play, which is, I've probably been talking about on your show for like 3 or 4 months. And there's a very talented producer who is actually putting it together and wrote the script. And I should mention that I actually have a starring role in the radio show, so I'm very excited about it. But it's taking somewhat longer to get done than we had hoped. We originally were shooting for Thanksgiving, then for Christmas. Now at best, it'll be up in early February, maybe a little longer. And your listeners might be interested in knowing this. The main reason that's the case is it's being produced remotely, meaning every single part, whether it's 2 words or most of the radio play, is recorded separately in a different place using different equipment to the producer's specifications, but then the producer has to put it all together and make sure everything's exactly right. And sometimes someone not only might make a mistake, but maybe the sound quality is not quite there. But what I can tell you is it's really going to be extraordinary. It has some original music in there. It's almost a little bit like a musical, which makes sense because it's an alternate history Beatles story. And I will say one other thing about it. I was very excited, and I reviewed and did my own podcast about it, and I'd highly recommend it, to see The Pale Blue Eye. This is a movie on Netflix about a very young Edgar Allan Poe, when in fact he was a cadet at West Point. And you and I have talked about this. A major element of the radio play, based on my short story, are these tunnels that run under Fordham. And one of the things I mentioned briefly in the story, and it's mentioned in the radio plays, maybe Edgar Allan Poe had something to do with the very construction of those tunnels in the first place, because he did indeed have a cottage on Kingsbridge Road that's within walking distance to Fordham University. So anyone who's a Poe fan, you might be especially interested in this. But I can't talk any more about it because, dealing with these possibly supernatural things, I have to be very careful.
No ghosts coming for you in any sort of revenge fashion. Paul, it's always a pleasure to have you on, and you're here about every 6 weeks, and within those 6 weeks, an amazing amount of things happen, actually. I'm very excited about, what is that, February 15th, the alternate history
Yes.
presentation. Yeah, I'll be looking for that, and that sounds great. I would just ask you to just stay with me until I sign off here so that I can have some words with you off air. And again, I thank you so much always for being on the podcast.
My pleasure, Bob.
That's Dr. Paul Levinson of Fordham University. That's it for this episode of Hot Media with Bob Mann. Please check out everything on the website about the show, www.bobmanhotmedia.com. And for those of you who are listening on the audio platforms, that's BOBMANN Hot Media. And the other thing is that this is still primarily an audio podcast, but whether you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Odyssey, whatever, I would ask you not only to listen, to watch, but also to subscribe. And thank you very much for joining us right here for another episode of Hot Media. Thank you so much.